Good morning. I'm sad that I can't be with you in person today, but I did want to prepare this special sermon for you. It's a sermon on shame, so you'd think I'd have a reading from Brené Brown, but instead I'm going to read someone that Brené Brown quotes in her book, Daring Greatly. So here are some words from Peter Sheehan, author and CEO of Change Labs. The secret killer of innovation is shame. You can't measure it, but it is there. Every time someone holds back on a new idea, fails to give their manager much needed feedback, and is afraid to speak up in front of a client, you can be sure shame played a part. That deep fear we all have of being wrong, of being belittled, and of feeling less than is what stops us taking the very risks required to move our companies forward. If you want a culture of creativity and innovation where sensible risks are embraced on both a market and individual level, start by developing the ability of managers to cultivate an openness to vulnerability in their teams. And this, paradoxically perhaps, requires that they are vulnerable themselves. This notion that a leader needs to be in charge and to know all the answers is both dated and destructive. Its impact on others is the sense that they know less and that they are less than, a recipe for risk aversion if ever I have heard it. Shame becomes fear, fear leads to risk aversion kills innovation. I'm going to do something unusual for me today. I'm going to talk about myself a lot more than usual. I think it'll be meaningful for you too, but I'll admit that I'm feeling a little self-conscious about it. You all know that I have been in search this year for a full-time ministry position. It's been a really challenging year for a lot of reasons and a very competitive one for full-time positions in Unitarian Universalist churches. It was also my first time experiencing the Unitarian Universalist search process, so there was a lot of feeling like I don't know what to expect. And if you don't know what the search process is like, I'll be very, very brief in giving you the lay of the land. In December, all of the congregations that are searching for a minister publish their congregational profiles, so ministers can read them. And then at the beginning of January, all the ministers that are searching for a congregation publish their ministerial profiles, and they can submit their profiles to various search committees of the churches where they think they'll be a good fit. And then search committees decide who to have a first interview with in January. After that, if the first interview goes well, search committees can invite ministers to pre-candidate. Pre-candidating is like a second interview that takes up an entire weekend. Through February and March, ministers can do up to 3 of those pre-candidating weekends. And if all of that goes well, in early April, ministers are invited to spend 8 or 9 days with a congregation as a candidate. And then the congregation votes to call them as a minister or not. Some churches and ministers don't find an ideal match the first time around, so there is a second, more compressed round of interviews in May. And there is a completely separate process for interim ministers, but that's a general sense of how a minister gets called by a congregation. I've been involved in this process since before January. And very early on in the process, I had a first interview with a search committee that went fairly well. And then a few days later, I got an email from the search committee asking me about the Church of Cosmic Indifference. Well, now I need to take a step back and explain what that is, or was. Some of you already know because you put the Church of Cosmic Indifference symbol on this beautiful stole you created for me. But for those of you who do not, when I finished my ministerial internship at a Unitarian Universalist church, I was scheduled to meet with the Ministerial Fellowshipping Committee in Boston. They are the folks that credential ministers and deem them fit for ministry in a Unitarian Universalist context. It's something that's supposed to happen prior to a minister's ordination if all goes according to plan. Well, I canceled that appointment with the Ministerial Fellowshipping Committee, and I took a few years to discern whether the Unitarian Universalist Church was the right place for me. I won't go into all of that today. A lot of you already know that piece of the story, and you know where it winds up. After some time, I got back on the schedule for the Ministerial Fellowshipping Committee, and this past October, they granted me preliminary fellowship without reservation, which is a big deal, and I am very proud of it. But I took the long way around to get there. In the meantime, I wasn't willing to give up on the possibility of being ministerial. I may have had my temporary doubts that the Unitarian Universalist Church was the place for me, but I still felt called to do some kind of ministerial work. So I started a church, sort of. I thought about what an ideal church might look like, and I landed at this odd intersection of cosmicism and humanism. Cosmicism is basically the belief that there is no higher power that's going to interfere with or intervene in the lives of human beings. Essentially, the cosmos is indifferent to humanity. That's a theology. You don't have to agree with it, but humanism is a response to that theology. If there's nothing out in the cosmos that's going to do anything for human beings, then we are responsible for the world we create. We are responsible for how we care for one another. We are all that we have, and that makes our relationships with one another pretty important. So I married cosmicism and humanism, kind of like a Reese's peanut butter cup, but something was still missing. Religions are about stories. Human beings like to learn from stories, but I didn't want to crib from an existing religious text, so I chose a living scripture that is still evolving. The genre of weird fiction, specifically weird fiction that expresses a cosmicist perspective first put forth by author H.P. Lovecraft. Although the stories themselves may not typically express humanist ideals, it was easy for me to superimpose humanist ethics over the stories. It wasn't what the authors intended necessarily, but I was all right with that. Sometimes stories teach us what not to do. Now, some of you know what kind of a person Lovecraft was and what kind of things he put in his stories, and you may not think that his ideas are worthy of consideration. But here's what I loved about this possibility. A lot of authors have taken Lovecraft's ideas and developed them in new directions. Authors from marginalized communities, including women authors, Black authors, LGBTQ authors, have taken some of these ideas and are still innovating new ways of using ideas that originated with a problematic writer from a century ago. I could talk about this stuff for days, and I did, because the Church of Cosmic Indifference was a virtual church. It didn't have a physical space, although there was some plan to get there eventually, but it started off as a weekly podcast. And eventually we were producing videos on YouTube. I wrote a book. The board of the Church of Cosmic Indifference didn't have a lot of money to invest in publicity, but we were all very willing to experiment and learn. That was my way of continuing to minister to people. When I started looking for a full-time ministry position, though, I knew that I couldn't do both. It takes a lot of time and energy. So I didn't even want to do both. Now that I am back in a Unitarian Universalist context, there really isn't a need to create something else. The board of the Church of Cosmic Indifference didn't want to try to keep going without me, and so we agreed to just shut it all down. All the videos and podcasts were still out in the wild, though, and obviously someone on a Unitarian Universalist search committee had come across them. So they asked, "What is the Church of Cosmic Indifference?" And I explained that it had been a way for me to continue affirming my ministerial identity while I was still in discernment about serving in a Unitarian Universalist context. I explained that it was something that was ending and I didn't expect to keep doing both. And I acknowledged that it was a way to explore alternative ways of doing ministry for people that would probably never be comfortable setting foot in a brick and mortar church. In fact, the skills that I developed are probably one of the key reasons that I was able to shift into doing virtual church so smoothly when COVID made that necessary for us. And she wrote back, "Thanks for the explanation. Best of luck." And I was off their list. I panicked. I thought, oh no, this thing that I thought was clever and innovative and intriguing is going to keep me from getting a job. This is bad. So I went through all the places that I knew that the Church of Cosmic Indifference existed online, and I started shelving everything. I dismantled its social media presence. I took down the YouTube channel. I wiped the website. I couldn't do anything about the book, but I just crossed my fingers that it wouldn't come up. But nothing online ever completely disappears, right? I was embarrassed by what I had created, or more accurately, I was ashamed. Someone had told me that what I had done was unacceptable, that it made no sense, not in those exact words, but still. I was ashamed of this thing I had created, and I was ashamed that I had been so proud of it. It was like Christmas for my inner critic. I thought, wow, you were so smug and irrationally confident. You better crawl in a hole and hide and hope nobody ever finds out about this. Shame on you. I got over it, obviously, if I'm telling you about all this today. And it didn't take a long time, but I had to stop and think through what I was feeling, which is to say, I took a step back to evaluate what I had experienced, the meaning that I had made of that experience, and the thoughts that were driving my emotions. Remember, shame and guilt are two completely different things. Guilt is about behavior. Guilt is recognizing that I did something or said something that didn't have integrity with my deepest values. I showed up in a way that wasn't my best possible self. I made a mess, and now I need to clean it up. That's guilt. Shame is about me, not about my behavior. Shame is about who I fear I am at the core of my being. I am worthless, or I am unacceptable. I am unlovable. I am broken. I am a failure. I am a burden. You can't fix it. It's just who you are at the core of your being. All of those kinds of things are shame. And all of those things are lies. Shame is the bundle of lies that we believe about ourselves. What I realized about the Church of Cosmic Indifference, well, I realized a lot of things. I learned a ton from doing that work. I was essentially writing a sermon every week, but I also learned about filing for a 501c3 and podcasting and video editing and all kinds of practical technical skills. I also learned about web marketing and what kind of research goes into choosing how to reach the right kind of people. And I learned about the value of board members who are willing to explore possibilities, and the value of board members who are very focused on the practical limitations, and the value of those two very different kinds of leaders collaborating on decisions. I grew a lot because of this bizarre project, but more than that, I ministered to people. I got emails from folks who were wrestling with really challenging experiences and really did not trust religious institutions, but somehow they were able to trust me to be their minister. I helped people recognize how to let go of their anger and resentment so they could take meaningful action. I helped people clarify what they really cared about and live into their values with integrity. I provided a space for folks who felt rejected and condemned by other churches and ministers so that they could feel accepted and affirmed and cared for. I created something worthy of my time and energy, and I am proud of it. I think it's time to set it aside and focus on one community, one congregation, full time. But that's more about being realistic about my time and emotional energy. I can tell you that I am in no way ashamed of the Church of Cosmic Indifference. But when one person said that it didn't make sense, when one person implied that I was unacceptable because of it, when one person suggested that I was unfit to be their minister, my shame gremlin got out all the confetti and noisemakers. I mean, my shame gremlin threw a party to end all parties. It was the biggest confirmation of every lie I have ever believed about myself not being good enough, or trying to be too big for my britches, as my mother would say. All the fear about me being unacceptable or unworthy bubbled to the surface because of one person. Now, I'm not going to say that their lack of acceptance says more about them than it does about me. I don't know why they were dismissive. That's not what this sermon is about. This sermon is about me and my relationship with my shame gremlin. It only takes a little provocation from the right person at the right time to get my shame voice going. And when it gets going, it can be the loudest thing in my head. But here's what shuts it down: taking a step back and putting things in perspective. I can say, this is what happened factually. This is the meaning that I made out of it, or this is the story that I've told about it in my head. Because the facts of what literally happened and the story that I fill in with my own imagination are two different things most of the time. I can track my emotions and see what thoughts are underneath those emotions. Like I could say, I feel really sad right now because I think I'm unacceptable. The truth might be that someone didn't accept me. That much could be true. But that's very different from me being unacceptable. In fact, I can name a lot of places where I have felt very accepted, and I can name a lot of people who have been very accepting of me. If I were unacceptable at my core, I wouldn't be able to say those things. That sort of introspection, digging into what I'm feeling and what I'm thinking honestly, and recognizing that those are two different things. Emotions and thoughts are completely different things. And also introspection about what I literally experience and what stories I'm telling in my head, what meaning I'm making from the experience. That personal work really puts a damper on my shame gremlin. And another thing is talking through it with someone I trust. Shame loves secrecy and silence. If I'm listening to my shame voice, I feel like I have to hide from people. I can't let other people know who I really am because they would judge me and reject me. So I have to keep it a secret and stay silent. But as soon as I decide to speak up, as soon as I break that silence, the spell is broken. As soon as I decide to get real with someone and say, I'm feeling really sad about this thing that happened, my shame gremlin loses power. Because in the telling of the story to another human being, I make realizations. And maybe that other person asks a question that reminds me of my accomplishments. Or maybe they just respond in a way that reminds me of my worth. Maybe they just smile and say, you are way too hard on yourself. That thing you created is amazing. In breaking the silence and being vulnerable with another human being, we take power back from our shame gremlins. And you may be saying, I don't really have a shame gremlin. I don't feel shame. That's awesome. And I don't believe you. If you have ever felt like you had to hide something about yourself, if you have ever felt like you needed to stay silent and not speak up about something, if you've ever been afraid of what another person would think of you, if you've ever been self-conscious about your body or your appearance, if you've ever been embarrassed about your work or lack thereof, if you have ever questioned your ability as a parent, if you have ever felt obligated to do something you didn't really want to do for family, if you've ever had a mental health diagnosis you were afraid to share, if you have ever hidden any kind of addiction, if you've ever been afraid that someone would stereotype or label you, that's shame. All of that is shame. That is what your shame gremlin does. And you have the power to make it stop. You can explore what you are feeling and you can identify what you are thinking. And the more you do this, the more you just name what you are feeling and what thoughts are making you feel that way, the more you can start to see what you are believing about yourself that may not be true. Like if you feel scared and realize that you're scared because you think you're unlovable, you can hopefully recognize that as exactly the kind of lie that your shame gremlin would tell. And you can start telling the truth about your lovability. You can honestly recognize what you literally experienced and what meaning you've made up about those experiences, what stories you've told in your head about what happened. That means telling the truth about events without judging them, just describing the exact things that happened with no personal interpretation. And then you can look at all the personal interpretation and judgments and recognize that all of that is meaning that you have made about the events. Like if I sent an email to someone last week and I haven't heard back from them, I can tell all kinds of stories about that. I can make that mean a lot of different things. But the facts are that I sent an email and I haven't seen a response yet. That's it. Everything else is supplied by my imagination. My email could be sitting in their spam folder, or their response could be sitting in my spam folder. We can explore questions and possibilities, but we start by being honest about what has actually happened. You can identify your emotions and the thoughts or beliefs connected to them. You can separate what you experience from the meaning that you make, and you can tell someone you trust. You can break the silence and stop hiding who you are and embrace the reality that vulnerability is a superpower. Authenticity makes our human bonds stronger, and it gives us back power over our shame gremlins. Vulnerability is how we cultivate trust and tell the truth about who we are in relationship with others. Yes, clean up all of the messes that you make, act with integrity, and be aware of when your actions don't line up with your deepest life affirming values. Course correct as you need to, but also realize that you have so much to be proud of, legitimately proud of. There is nothing about who you are that is shameful. You have inherent worth. You are worthy. You are enough. And you have the power to silence your shame gremlin and live into that worthiness. May you be so bold. Amen, and blessed be. As a reflection today, I invite you to consider these words. Being worthy and knowing it is an act of authentic humility. How did you get to be so worthy, so beautiful, so capable, so lovable, so amazingly amazing? You didn't ask for it. You don't remember ever doing anything to deserve it. And yet, here you are, worthy, capable, lovable, acceptable, beautiful. Being worthy and knowing it is an act of rebellion against a world that constantly asks us to prove ourselves and compete for attention. Being worthy and knowing it is an act of witness, modeling for a world of people who constantly doubt themselves how they too can be free. Being worthy and knowing it is freedom, an authentic and humble act of rebellion, honest testimony to the worthiness of all. Being worthy and knowing it is a calling from the depths of your spirit to be in love with who you are, with all of who you are. Lovable, acceptable, capable, beautiful, worthy. Amen.